minutes. I'm sorry, I'm not a German speaker, so I'll be talking in English. The title of the show is Metamorphosis, and a couple of years ago I was working on a series of photographs of dance and architecture and landscape, and I realized that I was interested in the theme of one thing changing into another. And when Heike proposed this exhibition, a survey show of my work, I immediately thought of the idea to title it Metamorphosis. Grab a little water. I came to photography when I was 25 years old. I went to art school and studied painting, sculpture, dance, video art, conceptual art. And when I was, after I finished with a master's from the California Institute of the Arts, I wasn't quite sure what to do. And in 1975, I discovered photography. And these photographs, photograms of my hands, I think of as my first photographic works, where I came to register the idea that photography would be something that was a medium that I could speak in, as it were. Oops. I've arranged this talk not in a strict chronological sequence, so I'm starting out with all of my works that I made as photograms. So I made these when I was 25 years old, and we were in the wrong talk. So for the show, Heike and Martin German and I selected bodies of work, and this is a non-chronological group of photographs, titles of work, and you can see the interconnections that I drew between these different bodies of work. So before I went to art school, I painted in watercolor. These are watercolors that I made when I was an adolescent in Connecticut. And in a way, one way to think about my work is that I'm still using a water-based medium. Photography involves fluids, liquids. Some of the most recent works in this show are a group of pictures known as chemograms. And these were made by painting with photochemicals on photographic paper. So these are in a way the kind of most, the least photographic works of mine, and they come closest to a way of working with painting. But I wanted to start out because they have a reference to those very early watercolors that I made when I was a teenager. In 2009, I made a series of photograms with water and powdered graphite. So these are cameraless photographs that I made in the darkroom. And then I took these monochrome photograms of fluids, and I colored them in Photoshop using a tool called gradient maps. Returning to this image that I painted when I was a teenager, this landscape, just to this side of it, is a very ancient oak tree that I returned to in 2014 and began to photograph. I photographed it also in 1979. So this also kind of comes back to my beginnings as a painter. The earliest work in this show is a Super 8 film I made, and it's in the same landscape that I painted as a teenager and I photographed just recently. It's in western Connecticut, where I was born. The work is, I created a sculpture, a mobile sculpture that hung in a tree and that rotated in the wind. And for me, the coming out of sculpture and painting and dance, all kind of unified in this film. I had just witnessed a performance by the choreographer Merce Cunningham in Pittsburgh when I was an art student, and I wanted to do something with Cunningham's ideas and also with John Cage's ideas about chance and indeterminacy. There are, I think, 4 video works in the show, and this is one of them. It's a very early work from 1972, where I was looking through parts of my hand. I was making shapes in front of the camera, and I was, I think, referencing kind of both a very small performative activity, and also the idea of a sort of lens or an aperture. And now we come to the photograms. So these were the first pictures that I seriously thought of myself as a photographer. And they come a few years after that video where I'm looking through my hands. The photograms were made in 1975, and in that same year, I made a sculpture by bending coat hangers. Before I committed to working exclusively in photography, I was still making sculptures and paintings. So this is really my last sculpture, and this is the way it looked in one of my studios in California, where I hung it on the wall. And this is gives the new structure to it. Initially it was on the floor, now it's hanging as a kind of cascade of shapes. Jumping forward again another 20 years, this idea of bending, folding, twisting is something that I was interested in the coat hanger sculptures. And then in 2005, I worked with pieces of screen and bent them, folded them, and made photograms out of them. So I think, this early kind of prelude in this talk, I'm looking at my relationship primarily to photograms and to aqueous or watercolor media. Another group of photograms, of which one is included in the show, images of strips of paper randomly distributed on the piece of photographic paper and then exposed. And also another cameraless work, my degradés, where I am shading the paper. Again, a kind of performative act. I think what ties all of these photogrammic activities together and the chemograms is a interest in the performance that happens in the darkroom. And these are made by shading pieces of paper, exposing one side, turning the paper around, exposing the other side. And now, going back to, this is now, we're starting again in 1976, 77, when I began to work in photography, and I created a body of work called Diary Landscape. These pictures are photographs of a diary that was written in 1840 by my father's great-grandmother. She and her husband took a trip to Europe, and they recorded their journey in 2 volumes, beautiful handwriting, little pieces of leaves, flowers, feathers were inserted in the diary. This was written in Genoa, Italy. And so what struck me about this diary, right when I was beginning to make photographs, the diary was written at the moment that photography was being invented. It was in, the first photographs were made in 1839. This diary is 1840. I also, as I was photographing the diary, I photographed the landscape around my parents' house in southern New England. I've exhibited these works over the years in pairs. So you have a landscape, a diary, and a landscape, and they alternate. One of the things that I discovered when I was making these photographs, I was using a camera on a tripod, an old wooden camera, and for me, the experience of making these photographs and beginning to acquire the skills necessary to process film and make prints, I really felt like I was in a time warp, that these pictures were being made in my beginnings as a photographer, but they were also recording in some sort of way the beginnings of photography. And my sense as I worked was that I was creating a time machine. And this is one of my insights about photography, is that it's the photography, in addition to fixing instants in time, instantaneous exposures, is also a medium that has a lot of temporal slippage. And I felt that that this was something that drew me to photography, that I could represent these ambiguous times, or that this was a time that you weren't quite sure when this picture might have been made. So it was photography was a time machine. In 1978, I moved to New York. I left California and continued making the diary photographs, but I also wanted to make a new type of photograph. And I began a project where I photographed a small piece of aluminum foil. I was fascinated by this sort of shiny, glittery sensuality or visual complexity of these pieces of aluminum foil. They're printed in a way so that the image is very dark. If I printed the picture the way it actually looked in the studio, it would be much brighter. So I was able to transform the image through the printing process. And this installation at the Kunstforum repeats a show that I did in 1981 when I first exhibited the aluminum foils in 2 rows, this sort of dense grid of images that where the experience of looking at the work, I wanted it to be all-encompassing or overwhelming in a way. For me, my early photographs are very small because I'm making contact prints. I'm printing the negative directly onto the piece of photographic paper, and it's a sort of very seductive transfer of the negative to the piece of paper. And one of my intuitions about photography, in addition to it being a time machine, is that photography is a miniature art, that it's about shrinking the world into this tiny space. And these photographs, which are, minuscule, you have to look very closely at them. And I think this is, I was fascinated by this very perfect transformation of my negatives onto the piece of photographic paper. Of course, we're looking at these, vastly enlarged. When you see them in the gallery, they're tiny. As I was working on the aluminum foil photographs, I also began to photograph a piece of fabric. It was actually, where is it? It's orange. But when I converted it to black and white, it became this sort of neutral gray. And I took this material that I was fascinated by, phyllo, it looks like paper, and I crumpled it up. It's basically flour. I crumpled it up and dusted it on the drapery. These were made in 1981, and I was showing at a gallery in New York, Metro Pictures, with artists like Cindy Sherman, Richard Prince, Sherry Levine, who were questioning what a photograph was, what a photograph could do, what a work of art, how it gains meaning. And for me, these pictures, which perhaps don't seem that related to the image appropriation work of Richard Prince or Sherry Levine or Cindy Sherman's continuing, metamorphosis of identity. These pictures for me fit into that general thematic because I was, like them, I was questioning how a photograph has meaning and what a photograph could possibly represent. I also worked with a piece of brown fabric. It's kind of luscious and shimmering in the light. And this is the way I showed them in Ghent. And someone had a wedding in my show. So that's a real couple getting married in front of my work. Some of my most serious work provides the backdrop for a wedding. After working in the studio for about 4 years, making these still lifes with aluminum foil or drapery, I wanted to emerge back out into the world. I wanted to leave the studio. And I was still fascinated by the 19th century, by this sense that the previous century has kind of deeded us a landscape, buildings, but for me, more importantly, was the landscape that the railroad created in America. And I wanted to look at this 19th century almost earthwork or earth sculpture, the railroad cutting through the forest. And so I began a project to photograph railroads in and around New York City, where I lived. And I had met the Beschers when I was a student in 1972 in John Baldessari's class. Hilla Bescher came and spoke about her work. And one of the things that struck me was that she said that she wanted, that their work was that they were almost like botanists, tracing the genealogy of certain building types. And for me, photographing the railroad was in a like spirit. I was tracing this technology back into the 19th century, but I only wanted to photograph contemporary trains and landscapes. So it was a combination of an older technology, but in the present. I also photographed factories and houses alongside the railroad, because these seemed to be things that were created by the railroad. And in the show, I've juxtaposed these pictures with my dégradé photographs, because at the time I was trying to make a connection between the dégradés, this sort of infinite space, and then the spatial relationships in the industrial landscape. But for me, these pictures are a kind of expression of a sense of what a black and white photograph can be, that I think I found for myself the perfect subject to print in black and white. So these pictures, in a way, are about the grays of black and white photography. So I would take trips and make photographs, and I worked with a camera that exposed 10 frames of film on a roll. It's called a Pentax 6x7 camera, and it shoots medium format 120 roll film. And in the process of making contact prints to look at my work, I could only fit 9 exposures onto the sheet of A4 photo paper. So I cut the 10th frame off and I put it aside. And then when I would have I would shoot 9 rolls of film, I'd have enough for another contact sheet of just these 10th exposures. And I began to look at these pictures, and they were strange images, because I realized that I didn't want to waste a picture, that I was able to waste that photograph, the 10th frame, and I would photograph something else. So I would sometimes photograph like something like this after shooting trains. So I began to think of a project that could include a lot of different subjects. And I began to photograph, as I told a friend, anything and everything. Seascapes, lighthouses, sinks, my homage to Bob Gober. I spent a lot of time in the early 90s. I showed a lot in France and Belgium, and this is a bakery in Brussels. One night I went out and took pictures on the street at night. So I began to accumulate these images which didn't fit in any series. They were just lots of different sorts of pictures. And in 1998, I was invited to do a book in Ghent, and I had to think of a title. And it was right at the last minute, the book was going to go to press, I had to title the work. And I finally realized that all of these pictures were photographs of light. And I called them light sources because, and these are various, obviously, light fixtures, but any subject, a portrait, a still life, is a light source because we see by reflected light and direct transmitted light. And I thought, what a wonderful way to make something with all of these different parts. And I was, as I traveled in Brussels, this is a picture taken in Portugal, I was able to leave my accepted sorts of conventions. I was able to photograph these different subjects, partly because I was in a foreign country. I moved to California in 1995, and this is one of the first pictures I made in Los Angeles when I started teaching at UCLA. I photographed this building by night and by day. I also included earlier works. This is a picture I made in 1977 of my friend, the artist Jack Goldstein. And as I worked on light sources in Los Angeles, I began to hear about a new technology to print the work. And initially I was making darkroom prints, and in the late 1990s, a number of artists were experimenting with digital inkjet printing. So I made these initially as, they're called iris prints. It's an early form of inkjet. So these pictures begin as film negatives and darkroom prints, and by the time I finished light sources in 2001, I was making them all digitally. So this body of work is about a kind of different subjects, and it's also, for me, my transition from making darkroom prints to working with a computer. And this is sort of a self-portrait because that's me in the bottom of the frame. I'm holding the camera up to my eye, and I'm substituting a light bulb for my head. In 1998, I bought a Macintosh computer and began to, I realized that one of the things that working with a computer, working digitally, allowed me to do was to think about color in a new way. When I moved to UCLA and started teaching, I also started teaching classes on color photography. I bought a color processor for the department, and we made C-prints. And as I made C-prints and learned how to print in color, I began to think about what is color? How do we see it? How is it made as a photograph or a book with this, video projection system? And I discovered that in our eyes, and this is all basic, things that you learn in almost elementary school, that we have red, green, and blue sensors in our eyes, and that our experience of color is mediated by these trichromatic sensors. And for a number of years, I thought about how I might be able to demonstrate this. So I photographed succulent plants in our front yard in Los Angeles on very sunny and windy days. So there were shadows moving across this plant. And I'm making 6 individual exposures on the same piece of film using red, green, and blue, which are the 3 additive primaries, and cyan, magenta, and yellow, which are the subtractive primary colors. So wherever there's a bright spot of color, a flash of light hit the plant as I had the blue filter or the red filter or the cyan filter over the lens. So these pictures were both hard to make because I couldn't reproduce these conditions very easily, and also very exciting because I was creating something in the camera that for me demonstrated how color works, how we can see the process of seeing. I was very excited about that project, and I showed it to some magazine editors in New York because I wanted to make architectural photographs using this process. And I was invited to photograph the Philip Johnson Glass House, a architectural icon in Connecticut, which was going to be open to the public. And a magazine in New York hired me to photograph it. But my editor said, I really like what you did with those hexachrome photographs, and everyone else is going to be photographing the glass house in a very conventional way. Why don't you do something, work with this hexachrome process? And so I went to the glass house, and I was all set up to make my exposures with 6 pieces of, it was 6 filters, but there was no wind. It was completely still. And so I realized this wouldn't work. So instead I had to improvise, and I began to hold the filters up in front of the lens, put them together the same way I did with my dégradé photographs, the colored photograms. And I began a 4-year project where I kept going back to the glass house with new ideas and new filters. I published my pictures in the magazine, but I kept going back, and the glass house became a laboratory for me to think about these very strange colors in the landscape. And I also bought an inkjet printer and began to make my own Epson color prints. So this project really starts me thinking about color and also about inkjet. And one of my strong ideas about photography today is that the inkjet process is very different than working in the darkroom. That it's ink on paper rather than light transforming dyes in a kind of almost chemical process in photography. This is pigments that are on paper. And I really enjoyed working with the kind of thick colors of inkjet. I also wondered if I couldn't do this same project in Photoshop, in the computer. I could just go and take normal pictures of the glass house and then alter them in Photoshop. But pictures like this, where I had a piece of glass in front of my camera, so I'm seeing what's behind me and what I'm looking at, a sort of double exposure, told me that I really needed to do it live on the site. So all of these pictures, there's very little darkroom work or post-production work. These are all done with a digital Canon 5D camera and filters in front of the lens. This is actually a small Polaroid print that I scanned. But in general, these are all 5D pictures with filters held in front of the lens. So I worked on the Glass House project from 2006 until 2010, and then I was looking around for something that would almost be the opposite of the Glass House. And the artist Andrew Wyeth died in 2009. Andrew Wyeth was one of my adolescent heroes. Those early watercolors that I showed you were very much in the school of Andrew Wyeth, a kind of naturalistic depiction of the world. And Wyeth is a very popular, very controversial artist in America. So I decided to go and photograph the places that he had painted in, Maine and Pennsylvania. So I got permission to photograph the very places that he painted, and I began to do post-production work on the photographs. So this door was a door with no sunlight, and I added sunlight in the studio in post-production. This picture, called Olson House, I photographed in September, and I took the snow from this photograph and put it in the bottom of this picture. So I began to transform these digital camera pictures. This is maybe hard to see. Some of the photographs are based on actual Wyeth paintings. This is a self-portrait, standing in a room with a window on the left and a door in the back. And I went to the room and photographed the same door and window. And then other pictures were taken in the vicinity, the region that Wyeth painted. This is one of his watercolor pads. And many of the pictures are transformed. In this one, I turned the ice a kind of blood color. And in this one, I bleached out the image. And although it's a sort of meditation on painting, it's also a meditation on color. And these are the pigments that Wyeth used. He painted in egg tempera. And of course, his library. So the last two projects I'm going to talk about developed 3 years ago. I was printing a book of photographs of my diary pictures from 1977 at a printing company in Rhode Island near Boston. And I was very struck by the sort of austere beauty of this printing factory. Everything was gray, white, primary colors. So I took my digital camera photographs and then removed all of the color and then reintroduced it in very intense bursts. So these pictures are subtly or largely changed. This picture we'll come back to, but this is I'll come back to this. Also, the process of printing books, reproducing color, again, here's the kind of soup of all the colors needed to all running together. So this picture is the key to the next and final group of photographs that I made called Choreograph. But this image is an artifact, a photograph of an artifact that you see in printing factories. It's a piece of scrap paper that has been run through the printing press a number of times. In analog printing, you need to run about 100 sheets of paper through the printing press to get the colors completely evenly distributed, and then you can start printing the signature. So the printers save these scraps of paper and then run them through the printing press another time and another time So you get these strange juxtapositions of images. It's called a make-ready in English. And I like that because it's the opposite of the ready-made. But the make-ready is this artifact of the analog printing process that I'm sure artists like Robert Rauschenberg and Dieter Roth were very influenced by in the 1960s. So this idea of combining images, one on top of the other, is something that I decided to explore in this final body of work called Choreograph. So each one of these images is composed of 3 black and white pictures that I've put into what are known as the color channels of a color photograph. So I have an image of a dancer. I studied dance when I was in college, and 40 years later I've come back to using dance imagery. Also there's an image of a landscape, and many times there's architecture in the picture. So I'm trying to find a way to make almost accidental multiple exposures. And it's hard to do that with a digital camera. You can't do that. With a film camera, you can make accidental double exposures. With a digital camera, it's a lot harder. And I wanted to invent a way that I could work more freely with digital, in the digital space of photography. And so these choreographed pictures, by combining three images in this sort of mashup, allowed me to create unexpected, strange juxtapositions, new colors, all artificially induced. So, so working with this sort of artificial color, in the back of my mind, I had another project, and this is the final thing I'll talk about. It's the film that concludes the show, and I'm going to need help getting to this. So, can someone help me with? So, my grandfather was a Sunday painter, and he had an ambition to paint a seascape. He didn't live near the ocean. He lived in Connecticut. He wrote to a noted seascape painter in 1930, how could he learn how to paint seascapes? And the seascape painter said, why don't you make a 16 millimeter film of the ocean so you can study it at home in your studio? So my grandfather made a film in 1931 of the Atlantic Ocean in a artist colony called Agunquit. And 3 years ago, I took that film and digitized it with the intention of making a color film from his painting. And his painting, we saw it in Diary Landscape. It's a black and white image, but I took a digital photograph of it and mapped those colors onto his black and white film. And then when I finished, I invited my brother to add sound effects, soundscape to it. He was also, my brother's a musician, and he was experimenting with composing music for accordions. So he combined the sound of rocks on a drum. You'll hear the sound of like waves crashing. Those are rocks in the studio. And then he composed a piece of music with accordions. So I'll play two excerpts, and then I'll take questions. So let's see. it's up in the gallery. For me, the film combines this idea of sampling color. The color is another tool, and I'm making a collaboration with my grandfather in a similar way that I collaborated with my father's great-grandmother in her diary. Seascape is a sort of transgenerational collaboration. And I think this is one of the things that, photography as a medium, as a time machine, is able to, communicate with these different eras, so that the work becomes sort of beyond time in a way. So that's the end of my talk, and I'll take questions. Let's see. Yes. Degradés? The question is referencing Rothko. Yes, I was thinking about Rothko, and I was very fortunate when I was a student. My class in 1969 visited Mark Rothko's studio, and it was an amazing experience. He was very frail, but we looked at paintings in his studio. Unfortunately, at that point he was making all black paintings. And I've always preferred the happy Rothko. There was a big show in New York recently of his monochrome, or it's called Dark Palette. And I think those are his least interesting pictures. I think he's such a fantastic colorist. I think a friend of mine was talking about Beethoven, and he said that Beethoven used all the keys on the keyboard. And with my new color photographs, I think I want to try to use all the colors in the inkjet printer. With those early degradés, it was very challenging to get those colors because I had to do a lot of experimentation in the darkroom, and there were lots of failures. So those pictures are truly analog experiences. They were extremely frustrating to make. So I'm very pleased to see them now, but they were very challenging in the darkroom. Yes. Yes. What was? How does what is a digital print? No. Yes. I think, photography, I'm not quite sure I understand the question, but I can talk more about the idea of the time machine. One of the important discussions in the last 30 years about photography is the idea of the index, that it's a record of an activity. And the photograph captures something in front of the camera. And this is what Roland Barthes calls this has been. So that every photograph records an activity in the past. But in a way, the photograph also communicates with the future. So this space in between the past and the future is something that I'm interested in. A photo theorist named Kasia Silverman has written a book called The Miracle of Analogy, and she's interested in the idea of the photograph as not only an analog process, but as an analogy. And she feels that the photograph never stops developing, that it's about this continuous development into time. And I think that's, I don't quite understand the implications of it, but I like the idea that photographs and works of art they start at a certain point and then they just continue and they change over time and as our experiences of them change. But for me, the idea of the time machine was that I could make a picture that looked old. I mean, it's like kind of really dumb idea, you know. It's like you could make something that looked like it was sort of steampunk or I mean, it's a very simple idea. You know, you can make a picture, you can sepia tone it, and it will look like it was made in the 19th century. But that also seemed to be to say something peculiar about the photographic apparatus and the photographic object, that it was that it's so temporally stamped at the time of its making. When you look at your parents' or grandparents' photographs, you can experience time. And I think this is one of the crazy things about Instagram. Instagram, with all its filters, is able to stamp, you know, make today's experience look like it was made in 1965 with a bad Polaroid camera. So you have these filters. And what is it about the fascination with Instagram's filters that says something about, I think it says that, you know, that photography is this temporal medium. It not only is made in time, but we sort of are very interested in that marking that technology stamps the photograph with. I'm not on Instagram, so don't look for me there. Yes, Eva.
The degradés, as you call them, are totally unique pieces, right?
Yes.
Even the photographs are unique pieces. Do you deal with editions? I mean, do you do editions on the latest work, for example?
Do I do editions on what?
Yeah, on photographs, on your latest work, for example?
Yes.
Yeah, you do editions.
Well, the work in the show, if you read the labels very closely, there are inkjet exhibition prints. I didn't want to borrow the originals, so I made copies. So all except one. There's one original photogram in the degradé presentation. The hand photograms are gelatin silver prints made from the originals, so those are also editioned. But the degradés are unique, as are the chemograms. The other works I create in editions. Yes, I'm back.
The aluminum folio
Yes?
pictures, what was the idea behind this picture? Did you get up in the morning and just thought that I will picture folio, or? But I really liked it from the design.
Yes, no. There's a lot of different things came together when I made those pictures. I I've always been very interested in abstraction. And I think, you know, now I can talk about it with a more sophisticated kind of way of thinking about it, but I was fascinated by abstraction and photography. And how do you make an abstract photograph? So I saw a piece of butter wrapped in aluminum foil in this weird, looked like a sculpture. I mean, it's in one of my catalogs. It's not in this show, but it looks like a helmet. It's a piece of metal foil, and I enlarged it, and it looks like a medieval helmet. And that kind of transformation that the photograph made of this piece of butter, I thought was very interesting. And so I made more photographs of aluminum foil, and then I realized that they were, that the light, the way it hit the foil and the way I printed it was very evocative. So I was interested in evoking different sorts of states, maybe. It was also, it's sort of funny to photograph aluminum foil, you know, and a lot of people have just thought it was just nutty. But to me, they presented different sorts of, lots of different images. And the economy of it was also really special, that I would use the same thing over and over, like those coat hangers, bending the coat hangers, it became these different shapes. But even more than the coat hangers, the aluminum foil, each one became this unique sort of fold and lit in a certain way. It was a little bit like photographing a book. I'd already photographed a book, now I was going to photograph this sculptural form. So it also takes up Moholy-Nagy's idea of the light space modulator, that you have this thing, you know, he made this sculpture that shines light on the room, and it's a sort of endless kaleidoscope. So that idea of making something, a machine that would make images was, you know, as I went along with it, I thought it was a really exciting concept. Yes?
You mentioned a couple of times a notion of medium, photography as a medium.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the time when you actually studied, which was really at a time when people really questioned the whole notion of a medium, introducing photography, and photography probably was a discipline that disrupted the idea of painting and sculpture as a medium, and there was a post-medium condition. Is photography today really a medium? If it is a medium, what makes it be a medium?
Okay, so the question is about photography as a medium, both in the 1970s and today, and the idea of post-medium condition. I'm perhaps not the best person to talk about post-medium, because I think I'm very committed to the idea of the medium. When I was a student in John Baldessari's class, you could do anything. John put a camera on a dog and had the dog walk around and take pictures. People would do performances, make Super 8 films, do mental performances, write texts, short stories. Anything, you know, went in John's class. And I participated in that, and I made videotapes. But I did performances. But for me, I felt really lost after school without the context of the John Baldessari's post-studio art class. And I went toward a medium, and that medium was photography, which I had not studied in depth at all. So I had to educate myself about photography. So my own experience was that I needed a medium to be able to find my voice. So that was me. And for me, the photography became this powerful history with, you know, its invention in the 1830s, but then its prehistory in all of the optical devices, and now, in a way, it's post-history. I like to think about my different projects, sometimes focus on sort of essential things about the medium. But for me, every new group of photographs focuses on a different essence of photography, as if there is no essence, that it's this constantly transforming relationship to subjects. I think so. It's all I can do is follow the medium as it presents itself to me. And now, you know, with digital practice, it's leading in a slightly different way. So I'm not the best person to talk to about a post-medium idea, because I feel very committed to still working in this, you know, thing called photography, even as it becomes more diffused. Yes?
It is such a big issue these days for young photographers to be or not to be on Instagram. You mentioned it before.
I've forgotten my password. And I've discovered that I like Facebook more. Facebook seems more democratic. And I try to post one video a day on Facebook that's 30 seconds long. I don't know if they're open to the public. You can just friend me, but I have a lot of friends I haven't accepted. So, but anyway, I like Facebook more than Instagram. I'm not sure why. My cousins can see what I'm doing. My nieces, other friends, other people. The few times I've gone on Instagram, I see my friend Stephen Shore has 30,000 followers, and I'm never going to get that high, so I'm not even going to try. And I also don't photograph food, so what I do on Instagram, I made 2 posts on Instagram. So I do have 2 posts, but then I forgot my password and my user ID and so. Yes.
I have a question. So you mentioned that you're sort of investigating the various essences of photography. So I was just wondering, is there a hierarchy or is there no hierarchy? With every new technological advance in photography, will you be open to investigating it further, or do you have a preference?
Do I have a preference for things to investigate? I make now 2 types of pictures. I work on the computer with the choreograph works and other related works where I take apart color channels and put them back together. It's kind of like psychedelic hippie photography, 50 years too late. And I throw chemicals around in the darkroom and make these messy, sloppy chemograms, which I'm trying to find ways to do them a little bit differently. So it's like those 2 very different ways of working are what I'm thinking about. I'm also working on some videos. I'm going to show a work at Rosemary Schwartzwalder's Login Gallery that opens next Tuesday. It'll be you can see it from the street. I recommend going in the evening because it's a video, but there's a lot of reflections during the day, and it's a lot of my outtakes from my dance photographs. I've animated all of my outtakes, and with a soundtrack that you can listen to on your phone, composed by my brother. So I'm also interested in animation and motion, but. I don't have any, apart from the chemograms and the choreographs, that's pretty much what I'm working on right now. My website has almost all my work on it, so you can see what I'm doing. I'm doing a new project in Chicago for the Chicago Architecture Biennial where I'm photographing Mies van der Rohe's architecture of his school, the IIT, Illinois Institute of Technology, and I'm working on a project about that, kind of combining these psychedelic techniques with film and digital capture. Okay, any more questions? Well, thank you so much for coming, and thank you.